Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Imagine standing in a crowded room, surrounded by family and friends, only to hear your own sister announce that your late husband, the love of your life, was actually the father of her unborn child. That alone was enough to make my world spin, but then she took it even further, demanding that I hand over half of my inheritance because, in her twisted mind, she and her baby deserved it. She thought she had everything planned, thought she had the perfect way to humiliate me. But what she didn't know was that I had proof, cold, hard documents that would turn the tables in an instant. The second I pulled them out, her face drained of all color, and suddenly, she wasn't so confident anymore. But that was just the beginning because after that moment, my entire family was thrown into chaos. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for days, unopened, taunting me with the pastel pink lettering that spelled out my sister's name. I had seen it the moment I grabbed my mail, recognized her handwriting immediately, and felt an instinctual wave of exhaustion wash over me. I knew exactly what it was before I even touched it. An invitation to her baby shower, a gathering where she would be the center of attention, basking in the glow of family and admiration, something she had always craved. Normally, I would have ignored it, tossed it into the trash with the rest of the things I didn't need in my life, but something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was some lingering hope that she had changed, or maybe I was just too tired to keep avoiding her. Either way, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the unopened envelope like it was some kind of ticking time bomb. Our relationship had never been easy, always filled with unspoken resentment, forced smiles, and thinly veiled insults that could cut sharper than any knife. Even as kids, she had always wanted what I had, always found a way to twist situations in her favor, always managed to turn herself into the victim whenever things didn't go her way. But ever since my husband passed away, things had shifted from petty sibling rivalry to something darker, something uglier. Instead of comforting me, instead of offering even the bare minimum of sympathy, she had treated my grief like an inconvenience, something that took attention away from her, something she resented me for. And yet, here she was, inviting me to celebrate the biggest milestone of her life, as if none of that had ever happened. I had every reason to decline, every reason to ignore her, every reason to assume that whatever she was planning had nothing to do with reconciliation and everything to do with stirring up more drama. But against my better judgment, against the little voice in my head screaming at me to stay away, I decided to go. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, maybe it was some deep-seated need for closure, or maybe I just wanted to see for myself if she was capable of being anything other than the selfish, manipulative person I had always known her to be. Either way, when the day of the baby shower arrived, I found myself standing outside the venue, gripping the small wrapped gift in my hands, wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. The moment I walked in, I felt a shift in the air. Conversations paused for just a second. Eyes darted in my direction before quickly looking away, and I could practically hear the whispers forming on people's lips. It had been a while since I had seen most of my extended family, and, judging by the awkward looks they gave me, they still didn't know how to talk to me without bringing up him. My husband's death had left a permanent stain on every interaction I had, and no matter how much time had passed, people still treated me like some fragile, broken thing that could shatter at any moment. My sister, on the other hand, was glowing, radiating the kind of attention she had always craved, draped in a flowy maternity dress that hugged her belly just right, making sure no one could possibly forget that this was her moment. She spotted me almost immediately, her eyes lighting up with an almost predatory delight before she made her way over to me, arms outstretched in a dramatic show of sisterly love. "Oh my God," she gasped, pulling me into a tight hug that felt more like a performance than an actual embrace. "I wasn't sure you'd come. This means so much to me." I forced a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach my eyes, and mumbled something about not wanting to miss her big day. She beamed, linking her arm through mine like we were the best of friends, like she hadn't spent the last year barely acknowledging my existence. "Come on," she said, guiding me toward the rest of the guests. "We have so much to catch up on." For the first hour, everything was surprisingly normal. She opened presents with exaggerated excitement, gasped dramatically at every tiny onesie and baby blanket, and played the usual baby shower games that made the room fill with laughter. A part of me even started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong about her, if maybe she truly had grown up, if maybe I had let my resentment cloud my judgment. But then, just as the guests gathered for the final toast, she stood up, cleared her throat, and in an instant shattered any illusion that this day had ever been about anything other than her. "I have a very special announcement," she said, placing a delicate hand on her belly, her eyes scanning the room, making sure she had everyone's full attention. I wasn't sure if I was ever going to say this, but the father of my baby is actually someone we all knew and loved. Something in my stomach twisted, my fingers tightening around the stem of my untouched champagne glass. I didn't know why I suddenly felt so cold, but something in the way she said it, in the way she was looking at me, made my entire body go rigid. She paused for just a second, her lips curving into something that almost resembled glee, before turning her gaze directly toward me. She took a deep breath, savoring the moment, my sister's late husband. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating, disorienting, unreal. The conversation stopped, the laughter faded, and the room fell into complete and utter silence. I felt my heart slam against my ribcage, my breath catching in my throat, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except stare at her, trying to process the impossible words that had just come out of her mouth. Then, like the crack of thunder after lightning, the murmur started. Gasps, whispers, stunned expressions. I could hear my mother's sharp inhale, my father's muttered curse under his breath. But my sister? She just stood there, her hand still resting delicately on her belly, watching me, waiting for my reaction like a hunter watching its prey. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe, but before I could even think of what to say, she kept going, her voice laced with forced sorrow. "I know this is a shock to everyone," she continued, glancing around the room with faux sympathy. "But I think it's only fair that since my child is carrying his blood, she deserves half of the inheritance my dear sister received after his passing." And just like that, I realized exactly what this was. This wasn't about truth. This wasn't about grief. This was about money. The shock was gone. The sadness? Gone. The grief that had been threatening to rise up inside me? Gone. All that was left was cold, sharp, unshakable clarity. I took a slow breath, straightened my shoulders, and looked her dead in the eye. "Are you sure you want to make that claim?" Her smirk faltered. I reached into my purse, my fingers wrapping around the very thing I had hoped I wouldn't have to use today. "Well then," I said, voice steady, "I guess it's time I show everyone what I brought with me today." The weight of my sister's words settled over the room like a suffocating fog, thick and heavy, wrapping around everyone present and squeezing the air from their lungs. The murmurs had faded into complete and utter silence, and for a brief, disorienting moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped moving. My vision blurred at the edges. My heart pounded against my ribs with a force so intense it made my fingertips tremble, and my stomach twisted into a sickening knot that made it impossible to breathe. My ears started ringing, the blood in my veins turning ice cold, and the only thing keeping me grounded was the sharp sting of my nails digging into the palms of my clenched fists. Across the room, my sister stood with one hand resting gently on her belly, her expression a perfect mask of manufactured sorrow. Her lips slightly parted, as if she were expecting sympathy instead of the absolute horror painted across the faces of our stunned relatives. Her eyes flickered with something dangerous, something hungry, as if she were thrilled by the chaos she had just unleashed, as if she had been waiting for this moment, savoring it, letting it build before finally delivering the fatal blow. And the worst part? She was enjoying this, basking in the attention, soaking up the shock and disbelief like a parasite feeding off the destruction it had caused. My parents were frozen, their expressions carved from stone, my mother's hand hovering over her mouth in disbelief, while my father sat rigidly in his chair, his knuckles white from the force of his grip on the armrest. The rest of our family exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to believe what they had just heard, some too stunned to react, others barely concealing their fascination at the unfolding scandal. Someone let out a nervous cough, the sound breaking through the oppressive silence, and suddenly, the air in the room grew thick with unspoken questions, their weight pressing down on me like a 1,000-pound burden I never asked to carry. I forced myself to inhale, deep and slow, struggling to keep my composure while every fiber of my being screamed at me to lash out, to scream, to throw something, to run. But I didn't move. I didn't let the raw, suffocating pain clawing at my chest show on my face. Instead, I swallowed the lump in my throat, tightened my grip on the stem of my untouched champagne glass, and met my sister's gaze with a look so cold it could have frozen the air between us. Before I could even process the implications of her words, Before I could fully comprehend the sheer audacity of what she had just done, she continued, her voice dripping with false regret, her tone expertly crafted to sound tragic. I know this is a shock to everyone, she sighed, shifting her weight slightly, tilting her head just enough to appear delicate, as if she were the victim in all of this. But I think it's only fair that since my child is carrying his blood, she deserves half of the inheritance my dear sister received after his passing. There it was, the real reason behind her entire performance. It wasn't about grief. It wasn't about some twisted confession. It wasn't even about him. It was about money. My lips parted slightly as realization crashed over me like a tidal wave, drowning me in a storm of emotions so intense I could barely contain them. My sister hadn't done this out of guilt, hadn't done this because she wanted to be honest, hadn't done this because she loved my late husband. She had done it because she saw an opportunity, because she saw dollar signs, because in her mind, my inheritance wasn't mine. It was something she was entitled to, something she deserved, something she could manipulate her way into claiming. Something inside me snapped, and suddenly, the suffocating sadness, the overwhelming grief, the crushing sense of betrayal, they were gone. In their place, something much colder settled in my chest, something sharper, something that turned my vision crystal clear and erased any lingering doubt about what needed to be done next. I straightened my shoulders, set my champagne glass down on the table with an almost deliberate slowness, and locked eyes with my sister, making sure she saw nothing but unwavering, unshakable calm in my expression. "Are you sure you want to make that claim?" I asked, my voice quiet but steady, each word carefully measured, each syllable carrying a weight she clearly hadn't anticipated. For the first time, her confidence wavered. It was small, barely noticeable to anyone else, but I saw it. The way her fingers twitched slightly against her stomach, the way her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, the way she shifted ever so slightly, as if a part of her knew she had made a mistake. But then, just as quickly as the hesitation appeared, it was gone, buried beneath a mask of feigned certainty. She started, her lips pressing together before she nodded, doubling down on her lie, on her scheme, on the sick fantasy she had built in her mind. "Yes," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "I'm sure." I exhaled slowly, nodded once, then reached into my purse. "Well then," I said, my tone eerily controlled, my fingers curling around the envelope I had been praying I wouldn't have to use today. "I guess it's time I show everyone what I brought with me today." Her expression shattered. In one smooth motion, I pulled out the thick stack of documents, held them up for everyone to see, then laid them flat on the table between us with a deliberate, measured movement. I could feel the tension in the room shift, could feel every pair of eyes locked onto me, could hear the barely concealed anticipation buzzing through the air like electricity before a storm. My sister's confidence, once so unshakable, so smug, so completely certain, was now cracking, her fingers curling in a fist at her sides as she stared at the papers as if they had the power to end her. And they did, because what she didn't know, what she never could have predicted, was that I had come prepared. My heart pounded, my pulse raced, my breath was steady. This was it, the moment she realized her entire plan was about to collapse. The second my sister saw the stack of papers in my hands, her entire demeanor shifted, her confidence faltering as the color drained from her face, leaving her looking like she had just seen a ghost. For the first time since she had made her outrageous claim, I saw something unfamiliar in her expression: fear. Not the kind of fear that came from embarrassment or social discomfort, but the kind of fear that came from realizing you had just walked straight into a trap with no way out. The smugness that had been radiating off her in waves just moments ago disappeared in an instant, replaced by rigid tension, her fingers twitching slightly as if she wanted to grab the documents from me before I could reveal what was inside. The guests, who had been frozen in stunned silence just moments before, were now shifting in their seats, their eyes darting between my sister and me, their curiosity growing with every passing second. My parents, still struggling to process what was happening, exchanged bewildered glances, clearly torn between wanting to demand answers and being too afraid to hear what was coming next. I could feel the weight of their stares pressing against me, could feel the anticipation thickening the air around us, but I didn't rush. I let the silence stretch between us, let the tension coil tighter and tighter, let my sister feel the weight of her own recklessness bearing down on her. She was shifting her weight from foot to foot now, her hands resting protectively over her stomach, her breathing growing just a fraction faster as she stared at me, wide-eyed, waiting for me to speak. I tilted my head slightly, studying her like she was a puzzle I had already solved, and then, in the calmest voice I could muster, I finally broke the silence. "You see," I said, my tone level steady, unwavering, "I knew you would pull something like this. I knew you would try to use my grief as a weapon, try to turn it into something you could twist for your own gain. So I came prepared." I let my words sink in, watching as a flicker of something almost like panic crossed her face before she forced herself to mask it. With slow, deliberate movements, I lifted the first document for the entire room to see, the rustling of the paper, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. "This," I continued, keeping my eyes locked onto hers, "is a copy of my late husband's medical records. And according to these reports," I paused, letting my voice sharpen just slightly, "he was diagnosed with infertility years before we even met." A collective gasp rippled through the room, an almost physical reaction to the information I had just thrown into the air like a grenade. My sister's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly like she wanted to argue, like she needed to say something, anything, to undo the damage, but she couldn't. She knew what those records meant, knew there was no talking her way out of it, knew that every single person in this room had just watched the foundation of her elaborate lie crumble beneath her feet. I could hear the murmurs starting again, hushed voices exchanging shocked whispers, the weight of the revelation settling over the room like a thick cloud. My mother, still clutching a glass of water in her trembling hands, looked like she was on the verge of dropping it, her mouth slightly open in stunned silence. My father, usually a man of few words, was staring at my sister with an expression I had never seen before, one of pure, unfiltered disgust. But I wasn't finished yet. Taking a slow breath, I flipped to the next set of documents, giving my sister just enough time to squirm before delivering the final blow. "And just in case that wasn't enough proof," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "I also decided to hire a private investigator. You know, just to clear up any lingering doubts about the real father of your baby." I watched as her face lost what little color it had left, her hands gripping the edge of the table now, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. "And surprise, surprise," I continued, flipping the page and turning it around so she could see the name printed in bold letters. "It turns out he's not my husband at all. He's actually someone very familiar to all of us." The second her eyes landed on the name, her body went completely rigid, her lips pressing into a thin line as if she was trying to stop herself from screaming. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. My parents, who had already been struggling to keep up with the sheer insanity of what was unfolding before them, now looked absolutely horrified. My mother let out a soft, choked noise, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as she read the name again and again, as if she needed to be sure that what she was seeing was real. My father, however, didn't move. He just sat there, completely motionless, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitching in his face. My sister, on the other hand, was falling apart. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore, wasn't trying to keep up the illusion of confidence, wasn't trying to act like she had everything under control. Her breathing was ragged, her fingers trembling as they hovered uselessly over her stomach, her eyes darting wildly around the room like she was looking for an escape, like she was silently begging for someone to step in and save her. But no one did, because there was no saving her from this. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice just enough so that only she could hear me. "You thought you could trap me," I murmured, my words slow, deliberate, sharp enough to cut through the last threads of whatever pathetic scheme she had left. "You thought you could humiliate me, steal from me, ruin me." I let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final nail in her coffin. "But all you did was destroy yourself." The room remained completely silent, heavy with the weight of everything that had just been exposed, but I didn't wait for her to say anything. There was nothing she could say, nothing she could do to undo the mess she had created, nothing that could make people forget what had just happened. She had walked into this party thinking she was untouchable, thinking she had control, thinking she had won. But now, she was just a liar with nowhere left to hide. The weight of the silence in the room was unbearable, thick with shock and disbelief, pressing down on every single person present as if they were afraid to even breathe too loudly. My sister stood frozen, her hands clenched in a fist at her sides, her face a pale, sickly shade that only made the contrast between her earlier arrogance and her current panic even more obvious. Her eyes darted frantically from the documents laid out in front of her to the horrified expressions of our parents, as if she were desperately searching for some way out, some excuse, some lifeline she could cling to before everything collapsed completely. But there was nothing she could do, no words she could say, no lies she could spin that would undo the damage that had just been done. The rest of the guests had begun whispering among themselves, their hushed voices carrying through the suffocating silence. The room now filled with an energy that felt more like a funeral than a celebration. I could hear the murmurs of shock, the gasps of disbelief, the shifting of feet as people exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of whether they should stay and witness whatever happened next or quietly slip out before things got even uglier. My parents, usually the first to defend my sister no matter what mess she had created, looked completely blindsided, their expressions shifting between confusion, disappointment, and something dangerously close to disgust. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my mother spoke, her voice shaking with something that sounded like desperate denial, as if she was still clinging to the last shred of hope that all of this had somehow been a misunderstanding. "Is this true?" she asked, her tone softer than I had expected, her gaze locked onto my sister, searching her face for some kind of explanation, some justification, anything that could make sense of the situation. My sister's mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but no sound came out, and for the first time in her life, she looked speechless. She turned her head slightly, eyes flickering toward my father, and I could see it, pure, unfiltered panic. She was trapped, and she knew it. I could have let her stammer, could have let her flail around in the wreckage of her own lies, but I had no interest in giving her the opportunity to rewrite the story, to twist the narrative into something where she was still somehow the victim. Before she could even attempt to spin another one of her carefully crafted manipulations, I decided to end it once and for all. "If you really want to argue about this," I said, my voice steady, controlled, unwavering, "we can take this to court. We can get a paternity test, we can get lawyers involved, and we can let everyone see just how much you've been lying." The second those words left my mouth, her entire body tensed, her eyes widening ever so slightly before she quickly tried to mask it, but I had already seen it. That flicker of sheer, undeniable fear. And that was the moment I knew she had lost. Because the truth was, there was no way she wanted this to go to court. No way she wanted an actual legal investigation into her fabricated story. No way she wanted the very system she had tried to manipulate to expose her instead. She had built this lie thinking that she would never be challenged, had convinced herself that the mere shock of her claim would be enough to make people believe her. But she had never expected me to come prepared, never expected me to fight back. And now, with the weight of actual evidence stacked against her, she had no way to escape the inevitable consequences of her actions. Her breath came out uneven, her fingers twitching slightly, as if she was fighting the urge to snatch the documents and destroy them before anyone else could read what was written on those pages. But it was too late. Everyone in the room had already seen them, had already heard what I had said, had already witnessed her entire story collapse in real time. And there was no undoing it now. My father, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke, his voice low, sharp, edged with something dangerous that made even me straighten my posture. "You lied," he said, his words slow, deliberate, filled with a weight that made my sister physically flinch. He didn't yell, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to, because the quiet disappointment in his tone was far worse than any screaming match could ever be. "You lied to all of us," he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief, his gaze never leaving her. "You used your own child as a tool to manipulate your family, to steal from your sister, to humiliate her in front of everyone." He exhaled sharply, pressing his fingers against his temples as if he couldn't even stand to look at her. "Do you even understand what you've done?" My sister's lower lip trembled slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. But I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, could see her trying to figure out if there was any possible way to fix the mess she had created. But there was nothing she could say, nothing she could do, because the truth was out, laid bare for everyone to see, and she no longer had control over the narrative. My mother, who had been standing frozen beside my father, finally let out a shaky breath, looking between my sister and the documents on the table, as if she still couldn't quite process what had just happened. "I just don't understand," she murmured, shaking her head slightly, her voice cracking. "Why? Why would you do this?" For a second, I thought my sister was going to cry, thought she was finally going to break down and admit everything, thought she was finally going to show an ounce of remorse for what she had done. But then, just as quickly as the vulnerability appeared, it vanished, swallowed up by the same self-preserving instinct she had always relied on. She took a slow, shuddering breath, straightened her shoulders slightly, and then, with a voice that was barely above a whisper, she uttered the one excuse that made my blood boil. "I needed that money. A stunned silence followed, as if the entire room had collectively misheard what she had just said, as if no one could believe that after everything, after being caught, after humiliating herself, this was the justification she was choosing to cling to. I let out a slow, humorless laugh, shaking my head as I finally allowed myself to feel the disgust that had been bubbling beneath the surface for so long. "You needed that money?" I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "So you thought the best way to get it was to lie about my dead husband being the father of your child?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to, because at that moment, we all knew the truth. This wasn't about need, it was about greed. And now my sister was about to lose everything. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, thick with tension and unspoken accusations, as if every person still lingering inside the house was too afraid to be the first to move, too stunned to process the absolute disaster they had just witnessed. The weight of what had just unfolded, the sheer audacity of my sister's lies, still hung over everyone like a dark cloud, pressing down with a force so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. One by one, the guests began to quietly excuse themselves, slipping away with hurried goodbyes, their eyes avoiding my sister, as if looking at her for too long would somehow taint them with the shame she should have been feeling. Some of them shook their heads in disappointment. Others simply murmured awkward apologies as they grabbed their coats, while a few exchanged hushed whispers, their gazes flickering toward my parents as if they were somehow responsible for the absolute mess their daughter had created. My sister, standing in the center of it all, refused to meet anyone's eyes, her hands shaking as they clutched her stomach, her fingers pressing into the fabric of her dress in a way that was so calculated it made my skin crawl. It was a desperate attempt at damage control, a final attempt to make people see her as fragile, as innocent, as someone who needed protection rather than condemnation. But it was clear that the damage had already been done, that there was no amount of sympathy she could milk from the situation that would undo the absolute disaster she had created for herself. My parents stood stiffly near the door, their bodies rigid, their expressions unreadable, but I could feel the weight of their emotions just by looking at them. My father's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching near his temple, his hands curled in a fist at his sides, his entire body vibrating with an anger I had never seen from him before. My mother, on the other hand, looked lost, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something, anything, but couldn't find the words to make sense of what had just happened. The illusion they had once clung to, the idea of their perfect daughter, had been shattered beyond repair, and now they were left standing in the ruins of a lie they had unknowingly enabled for years. The moment the last guest finally walked out the door, the silence that followed was almost unbearable, stretching between us like a chasm, deep and unrelenting. My mother turned to me, her eyes wide with something I hadn't seen in years, guilt. She hesitated for a second, her fingers tightening around the edge of her dress, as if she needed something to hold on to, before finally speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" she asked, the words cracking slightly, as if she already knew the answer, but couldn't bring herself to accept it. I let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking my head as I stared at her, my chest tightening with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't far from it either. "Would you have believed me?" I wanted to scream, wanted to throw every ounce of frustration, every buried resentment, every wasted year of trying to prove myself in her face. But instead, I simply asked the question that had haunted me for as long as I could remember. "Would you have believed me?" The way her gaze dropped to the floor, the way her shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the way she couldn't meet my eyes, told me everything I needed to know. The truth was, my mother had always made excuses for my sister, had always been willing to overlook the manipulation, the deceit, the selfishness, because it was easier than admitting that her daughter was capable of such cruelty. No matter how many times my sister had hurt me, no matter how many times I had tried to make them see the truth, my mother had always found a way to justify it, to explain it away, to tell herself that my sister wasn't really a bad person, just misunderstood, just struggling, just acting out. But now, there were no excuses left. My father, who had been eerily silent up until now, suddenly turned to my sister, his voice cutting through the heavy tension like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. "You lied to all of us," he snapped, his tone filled with an anger so raw it made my sister physically flinch, as if she hadn't expected him to actually hold her accountable. "You used your own child to try and steal money from your sister. How dare you?" For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I saw a flicker of something resembling fear cross my sister's face, a crack in the carefully constructed facade she had been trying so hard to maintain. But instead of admitting what she had done, instead of apologizing, instead of taking responsibility for the absolute chaos she had caused, she did what she had always done. She played the victim. Tears welled in her eyes, her lips trembling as she let out a shaky breath, her entire body tensing as if she were about to collapse from the weight of it all. "I needed that money," she whined, her voice unsteady, shaking, pathetic. "I didn't have anyone else to help me, and I knew you wouldn't just give it to me if I asked." My father let out a bitter, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head as he took a step back, as if he couldn't stand to be near her anymore. "So your solution," he said, his voice laced with disgust, "was to destroy your sister's reputation? To lie about her dead husband? To stand in front of our entire family and manipulate them into thinking you were entitled to something that was never yours to begin with?" He scoffed, running a hand down his face, exhaling sharply, as if he was trying to contain the sheer rage bubbling beneath the surface. "You are unbelievable." I watched as my sister's breath hitched, as her eyes darted back and forth between our parents, searching for something, waiting for my mother to jump in, to defend her, to save her from the consequences of her own actions. But my mother said nothing. She just stood there, silent, her expression torn between heartbreak and realization, as if she was finally seeing her daughter for what she really was. My sister's lip quivered, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress tighter, her breathing shallow, uneven, panicked. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she choked out, her voice cracking, her entire body trembling, as if she could somehow convince us that this had been a mistake, a miscalculation, rather than a carefully crafted scheme. I thought." "No," my father interrupted, his tone final, cold, resolute. "You knew exactly what you were doing." And for the first time in her entire life, my sister had nothing left to say, because there were no more lies to hide behind, no more excuses to fall back on, no more family to protect her from the consequences of what she had done. I stared at her, completely speechless, because even after everything, after being exposed in front of the entire family, after trying to steal my inheritance by fabricating the most disgusting lie imaginable, she still had the audacity to act like she was the victim in all of this. There was no remorse in her expression, no shame, no real understanding of what she had done. Only desperation, only the frantic realization that she had lost, and that there was no coming back from this. My stomach twisted in disgust as I watched her desperately scan the room, her eyes darting between our parents, searching for some sign that someone would pity her, that someone would step in to save her from the consequences of her own actions. But my father? He was done listening to her excuses. His patience had run out, his tolerance for her manipulations had finally shattered. And as he stepped forward, his voice was laced with something so heavy, so full of disappointment, that even I felt the weight of it. "You betrayed your own sister," he said, his words slow, deliberate, filled with a cold, measured anger that made my sister flinch. "You stood in front of your entire family and lied, knowing full well that what you were saying wasn't true, knowing that you were dragging her husband's name through the mud for your own personal gain. You tried to ruin her reputation, tried to steal what wasn't yours, tried to manipulate us into feeling sorry for you. And for what? Because you wanted money?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. "There is no excuse for this." Not for a moment, I thought that would be it, that my sister would finally accept her fate, that she would finally realize that she had no way out, but instead, she did what she always did. She tried to twist the narrative, tried to rewrite the story, tried to force everyone into seeing her as the real victim. Her eyes welled with tears, her lips quivering as she let out a shuddering breath, her entire body shaking as if she were on the verge of collapsing from the sheer weight of her suffering. "You don't understand," she whimpered, her voice cracking as she shook her head dramatically. "I was desperate. I didn't mean for it to go this far. But before she could even finish her sentence, my mother, who had been standing there in stunned silence, finally snapped. "Enough," my mother said, her voice louder than I had ever heard it before, the sound cutting through my sister's crocodile tears like a blade. My sister immediately froze, her breath hitching in her throat, her hands curling in a fist at her sides, as if bracing herself for the impact of what was coming next. My mother took a slow, measured step forward, her eyes burning with something I had never seen from her before: rage. "Stop lying," she continued, her voice trembling, but not from sadness, from fury. "Stop manipulating. Stop acting like this is anyone's fault but your own." For a moment, my sister looked like she was going to interrupt, like she was about to beg for forgiveness. But my mother didn't give her the chance. "We have always supported you," she spat, her voice filled with years of frustration, years of enabling, years of ignoring what had been in front of her all along. We have always given you the benefit of the doubt, always made excuses for you, always believed that you would change. And this, she gestured toward the table, toward the evidence of my sister's betrayal, toward the wreckage of what should have been a family gathering, but had instead turned into an exposé of my sister's deceit. This is how you repay us? For the first time, my sister had nothing to say. She just stood there, shaking, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, her hands trembling so violently that she had to clench them in a fist to keep them from shaking visibly. It was over, and she knew it. There was no talking her way out of this one. No sweet-talking her way back into our parents' good graces. No rewriting history to make herself look like the victim. She had burned every bridge she had left, and now she had to face the consequences. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the finality of what had just happened, thick with the knowledge that something between us had been broken beyond repair, something that could never be put back together again. My father let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face, as if trying to process the sheer magnitude of his daughter's betrayal, while my mother simply stood there, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable, but her anger still simmering beneath the surface. And my sister? She looked small. Not in the way that made you feel sorry for someone, not in the way that made you want to comfort them, but in the way that made you realize just how weak they truly were. She had spent her entire life manipulating those around her, feeding off their guilt, controlling the narrative so that she was always the one people sided with. But now, with the truth laid bare for everyone to see, with her lies exposed, with the last of her family turning against her, she had nothing left. I could see it in the way she stood there, frozen, lost, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, her mind scrambling for something, anything, that could undo what had just happened. But there was no undoing it. She had pushed things too far, had played with fire for so long, had built her entire world on lies, and now, finally, that world was collapsing around her. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel anger toward her. I didn't feel resentment. I didn't even feel satisfaction. I just felt nothing, because she had never been my sister. Not really. And now, she had no family left at all. The days that followed were eerily quiet, as if my family was standing in the wreckage of something that had finally collapsed after years of cracks forming beneath the surface. My parents didn't say much at first, both still reeling from the realization that their daughter, the one they had spent years defending and excusing, had been capable of something so cruel, so calculated, so ugly. But one thing became clear almost immediately. My father was done. He refused to speak to my sister at all, refused to acknowledge her presence, refused to even look at her if she so much as tried to approach him. It was as if she had ceased to exist in his world, as if the person he had spent a lifetime raising had been nothing more than an illusion, one that had finally shattered beyond repair. My mother, however, struggled. She was torn between the habit of wanting to protect her child and the stark, undeniable truth that my sister had pushed things too far, had crossed a line so deep that even she, the woman who had spent her entire life excusing her, couldn't justify it anymore. She didn't scream, didn't argue, didn't cry the way I expected her to. She simply sat at the dining table most nights, staring into space with a look of quiet devastation, as if mourning something she had lost but didn't know how to let go of. But despite the pain of finally seeing her daughter for who she truly was, she did something I had never seen her do before. She told my sister she was on her own. No more financial support, no more help, no more fixing things when they went wrong. And my sister? She couldn't handle it. For the first time in her life, she had no safety net, no fallback plan, no parents to clean up the mess she had created. She tried, of course. She begged, pleaded, cried, throwing herself at my mother's feet in an attempt to force her way back into her good graces. But it didn't work. My mother didn't cave, didn't let herself be manipulated, didn't let the tears cloud the facts that had been laid out so brutally in front of her. She had spent years believing that her daughter was simply misunderstood, that she was just struggling, that she needed extra help. But now she finally understood the truth. My sister didn't need help. She needed consequences. With nowhere else to turn, my sister started reaching out to extended family, sobbing into the phone about how she had been abandoned, spinning the same tired narrative she always had, hoping that someone, anyone, would take pity on her. But this time, no one did. What she had done wasn't something that could be brushed under the rug, wasn't something that could be excused with a sympathetic sigh and a promise to do better. She had lied, publicly, maliciously, and the worst part? She had done it for money. Even the relatives who had once been on her side, the ones who had always been quick to say that families should stick together, refused to entertain her sob story. No one wanted to be associated with her anymore. I heard through mutual connections that she tried to stay with a friend, someone she had always managed to manipulate in the past, but that arrangement didn't last long either. She had burned too many bridges, left too much destruction in her wake, and the more people learned about what she had done, the faster they distanced themselves. It was strange, in a way, to witness the slow unraveling of someone who had spent their entire life believing they were untouchable, someone who had always been so confident in their ability to weasel their way out of any situation. But there was no escaping this. The consequences had finally caught up with her, and for the first time, she had no one left to shield her from them. And me? I felt free. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of my sister's jealousy, wasn't being compared to her in ways that always left me feeling like I was somehow lacking, wasn't being forced to prove myself in a family that had never truly seen me for who I was. I wasn't waking up every morning dreading the next call, the next accusation, the next scheme she would come up with to drag me down just to make herself feel taller. I had spent years feeling like I had to fight for a place in my own family, feeling like no matter what I did, I would always be secondary to someone who took without giving, who demanded without gratitude, who destroyed without remorse. But now, that fight was over. And honestly, I had never felt better. After everything that happened, after the chaos, the betrayal, and the absolute devastation my sister had left in her wake, I finally did something I hadn't done in years. I focused on myself. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next time she would drag me into one of her toxic games. Wasn't bracing for another manipulation, another lie, another attempt to make me feel less than. It was strange, almost unsettling at first, like I had been holding my breath for so long that I didn't know what it felt like to breathe freely anymore. But slowly, bit by bit, I let go of the weight I had carried for years, the burden of trying to be the better sister, the bigger person, the one who always had to rise above no matter how many times I was dragged through the dirt. I didn't care what my sister did next, didn't care if she tried to spin a new story, didn't care if she found someone else to manipulate, didn't care if she still sat in the ruins of her own making, waiting for someone to come save her. She was no longer my problem. She could lie, she could beg, she could cry to anyone who would listen, but it wouldn't change the fact that she had destroyed herself, that she had burned every last bridge and had no one left to blame but herself. She had spent her entire life taking from people, believing she was owed something, believing that as long as she played her cards right, there would always be someone willing to clean up her mess. But now, she had finally run out of people to manipulate, and I wasn't wasting another second of my life worrying about what came next for her. Meanwhile, my parents, while still struggling with their own guilt, finally saw my sister for who she really was. They no longer tried to justify her actions, no longer tried to paint her as someone who had just made a mistake, no longer asked me to be the one to extend an olive branch. For the first time, they accepted that some wounds don't heal, that some betrayals are too big to come back from, that no amount of shared blood can force forgiveness where it isn't deserved. And for the first time, they didn't ask me to fix things, didn't ask me to be the one to hold the family together, didn't ask me to carry a weight that was never mine to carry in the first place. It wasn't an easy journey, learning how to let go of a family dynamic that had defined my entire life, learning how to exist without the toxic expectations that had been placed on me since childhood. There were days when the anger still bubbled beneath the surface, days when I found myself questioning how things had gotten so bad, days when I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there had been a way to prevent it all from falling apart. But the more distance I put between myself and the past, the more I realized that this wasn't something I had lost. This was something I had escaped. I moved forward, slowly at first, but then with more confidence, more certainty, more freedom. I focused on my own happiness, my own goals, my own peace, without the constant shadow of my sister's jealousy, without the endless cycle of trying to prove myself to a family that had never truly seen me for who I was. I reconnected with friends I had drifted away from, started saying yes to opportunities one would have once second-guessed, built a life that belonged to me rather than one that revolved around the expectations of others. And with each passing day, the weight of my past became lighter, the scars became less raw, the memories less painful. And my sister? She became nothing more than a name I used to know. So if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, if there's one lesson I wish I had understood sooner, it's that family isn't about blood. It's about trust. It's about respect. It's about knowing that the people in your life value you, not just for what you can give, not just for how much you're willing to sacrifice, but for who you are at your core. And once that trust is broken, once you see the truth of who someone really is, sometimes the best thing you can do, the only thing you can do, is walk away and never look back.